Good afternoon. I think we are live now. Good afternoon. Welcome to the WTO Public Forum. This is a panel working session on the crucial role of international services trade related to trade in healthcare products. It's a very long title. That tries to explain that while the discussions at the moment in the WTO on post-pandemic trade are very much focused on delivering the medical goods, which is of primary importance, there actually needs to be supporting services, including cross-border services, to be able to just bring vaccines, masks, all sorts of medical equipment and medicines to the people in crisis situations. We had a very interesting pandemic situation. I mean, this situation has been around for 18 months. We had a first phase that started in March 2020 with a trade collapse, with restrictions to travel, restrictions to trade, borders closing down, export restrictions on everything from goods to medicines. And then we had a second phase where the economies were selectively opened up again. And then we had a third phase where policymakers started thinking it would actually be very useful to have trade rules that allow the trading system to be resilient in such pandemic situations, because the notion is that we're probably not at our first global pandemic. To discuss this perhaps slightly under-discussed issue of services, we have four eminent panelists with us. We have Diane Lacoste-Chevalier, who replaces Thomas Levaillant, who's officially on the program, but had to leave for family reasons. So Diane Lacoste-Chevalier is counselor at the European Union mission to the WTO here in Geneva. We have Sherry Stephenson. Sherry is an eminent academic, and she currently is convener at the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council. We have Thomas Ellmann. He is a vice president for life sciences and healthcare at the German delivery company DHL, to bring us a bit of sort of real life experience on these issues. And we have Craig Arnold, who's also a vice president at UPS, an American delivery services company, and Craig deals with healthcare issues and notably also with developing countries. This is so to open the conversation, I will give the floor now to Diane. Diane, what is right now the conversation in the WTO, and what is the EU trying to achieve ahead of the next ministerial conference, MC12, in terms of trade, healthcare, trade in goods, and perhaps also trade in services? The floor is yours.
Many thanks, Yana, and good afternoon. Many thanks for the discussion. Looking forward to our exchange today. Indeed, Thomas was looking forward to participating today, but he had a last-minute impediment, so I'm delighted to step in and participate today. Indeed, I mean, the EU has been very active on the trade and health front, not only the EU, but a number of WTO members as well. So I'm happy to share a few insights on the more specifically the trade and health initiative, which is very much an incarnation of EU's commitment towards a coordinated action at global level in response to the crisis, with very much a sense that the WTO has and will have a role to play in response to the current crisis, but as well to prepare for future pandemics. So the Trade and Health Initiative very much builds on the lessons learned throughout this crisis, and is very strongly solution oriented. So I cannot go into the details of the suggestions, but would maybe sketch out its key features. So the initiative actually sets out a number of key principles that really aim at promoting a trade conducive environment. And this is first by minimizing trade frictions, so providing transparency and exercising self-restraint in terms of export restrictions, as well as promoting trade facilitation, as well as regulatory cooperation. It's very much as well about promoting strengthened cooperation with relevant international organizations, as well as with private stakeholders. All this is very much with a view to increasing the production as well as the distribution of vaccines, of their inputs, and on any critical goods that have proved really essential in this response. So the initiative, of course, recognizes that services play a key role in supporting the smooth functioning of supply chains, and this is typically freight, logistics, distribution. This initiative enjoys growing support, and it has now the backing of more than 50 members. But what is more interesting is that those members are very diverse. They are from different economic sizes, they come from very different regions in the world, they are at different levels of development, and still they coalesce around a set of key policy orientations. Where are we now? Clearly, we're only a few weeks ahead of MC12, and the pandemic continues unabated. And in the different dialogues that the WTO Director General has had, in particular with stakeholders in industry, we see that there are clear expectations that there would be a WTO contribution, not only at MC12, but also that there would be a way forward past MC12 to address these critical issues. Obviously, the debate is delicate, it's multidimensional. I mean, as we all know, the spotlight is very much on intellectual property, but there are contributions on other strands as well. And just to say that recently, for instance, the US have set out a number of ideas. So the ingredients for taking actions are there. It's now more a matter of finding the right combination, the right balance, as mentioned, not only for MC12, but as well for the post-MC12 phase. Hello, Yana. I think you're muted.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for this introduction. There will certainly be a lot of follow-up questions later. But let me give the floor now to Sherry to give us a more Pacific perspective. Sherry, the conversation about trade in the pandemic has strongly focused on goods, and here as you know, as would also be said on IP, but we will not go into IP in this panel. But what about services? Don't we need services to deliver these goods? How can these be encouraged? And can you give us precisely a perspective from APEC, from the Asia Pacific Economic Caucus? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ilana. Delighted to do so. Thank you to Pascal Canaïs and the European Services Forum for organizing this panel. I'd like to make two main points. They're both, of course, on services. My first point is that services must be included as an integral part of the WTO trade policy response to the pandemic. Why? Because services are essential in facilitating the movement of medical equipment, vaccines, and therapeutics across borders. We have Thomas Ellman from DHL, and I'd like to cite a couple of figures from a recent DHL white paper that state between 7 and 9 billion doses of the COVID-19 vaccine and ancillary supplies and therapeutics will be distributed over the coming 2 years. This is a huge amount, and it will require that all actors, public and private, work to improve the operation of logistics infrastructure, open borders to allow for the movement of these essential goods, and also facilitate supporting services to ensure that these goods can be transported and reach their destination. I found it striking that at present, more than 95% of COVID-19 vaccines are produced in just 8 countries, but we need to have them transported, delivered, and administered to people in nearly 200 countries around the world. So obviously, clearly, action is required for transportation, supply chain coordination, and all types of logistical support to make this successfully happen. Many services are critical to achieve this. We think offhand of transport services, flights, maritime shipping, rail and road transport. And then we think of all aspects of logistics, storage, warehousing, distribution of the goods in destination countries, and others. And this is correct. But there are also other services that are critical to this process. And these include financial services, as well as IT services, telecommunications, computer and data services. All of these are working behind the scenes, even if they're not visible. Many also argue for the inclusion of people involved in these services, crews on the ships and the planes, the medical personnel required to cross borders to assist with vaccination and administration of the medical necessities. So we only have to witness currently, pick up any newspaper, the Wall Street Journal yesterday, and read about the bottlenecks that are now occurring in global shipping, with freight ships waiting to disembark and unload at major ports, sometimes for weeks at a time. This allows us every day to appreciate even further the vital role of services. My second point, there has been insufficient attention paid at the WTO to the role of services in its discussions on the COVID pandemic. Services should be and have to be a critical part of a holistic approach to the pandemic response. While Ilana mentioned, the WTO has spent a lot of its time, most of its time over the past year and a half, devoting it to a discussion of an exemption to the TRIPS agreement to allow for the production of generic vaccines. Recently, several proposals have been advanced in the WTO General Council as to what might be included in a WTO declaration on trade and health for the coming MC12, and our EU representative spoke to this, to one of these major proposals. However, briefly perusing the 82 submissions that the WTO has received related to the pandemic, I found very few mention of services. So I'd like to perhaps bring up here the role of APEC as being notable in having taken the lead in this regard. The 21 member economies of the Asia-Pacific regional grouping, which account for fully 50% of world trade, this year acknowledged the vital importance of services and facilitating trade in essential goods as part of their APEC Trade Ministerial Declaration of June 2021. This statement builds upon the declaration of the prior year, 2020, on facilitating the movement of essential goods. So they stand as companion pieces. The recent APEC statement relevant to services does 3 major things. The first, it recognizes the vital role that services play in supporting the movement of essential goods, as well as in the distribution of vaccines, and it commits APEC economies to work together to facilitate the supply of services in supporting this movement. Second, it tasks APEC economies with prioritizing and identifying unnecessary barriers to trade in any relevant service that may hinder this movement. And third, it commits APEC economies to ensure the smooth and continued operation of logistics networks that serve as the backbone of global supply chains, through enhancing the role of logistical services. So this declaration also, APEC committed to a 2-year project which will canvass government policies towards critical services. We can talk about this more in the discussion. And I think that the WTO could usefully draw upon this example from APEC as it deliberates the content of its draft declaration and future work program on trade and health. Thank you very much. I think you're muted, Ilana.
Yes. Okay. So I've just shared the ministerial statement on Zoom. So the links to it. I hope that goes through. Okay. That was extremely enlightening and shows how, what happens in the WTO might be sometimes a bit disconnected, it feels, from what perhaps is really needed. Thomas, tell us how, on your experience on the ground throughout the pandemic of delivering vaccines across the world. How has this worked? How does this work? And what are your conclusions for trade policymakers? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Iyana, and thank you for the organizers in having us here on the panel. So we very much appreciate that possibility. So let me briefly explain to you a little bit the journey we as a company went over the last couple of months. So Deutsche Post DHL started very early in summer last year to look at the overall situation, and we launched our first white paper in September, where we had a review on what are our learnings from the PPE surge that happened in spring last year. And we also gave an outlook at that time. That was a situation when no vaccine was approved yet, about how to ship 10 billion doses to the world, and how to do that also with all of a sudden minus 70 degrees, which for the life science logistics industry is not unknown, but certainly in that big volume, very unusual as well. So we launched that white paper, and in parallel, we also started to prepare ourselves and to prepare our life science infrastructure worldwide. And we're operating in more than 200 countries on how to cope with these challenges. So we increased basically our capability in dry ice monitoring and refilling. We installed ultra-low freezer farms in strategic places. And we obviously trained our people and established SOPs to handle effectively and safe with dry ice and processing these shipments as well. And then in November, December, we started the shipments with the first approved vaccines. And we saw, yes, it is possible if you really prepare good enough for that. And after 6 months in the execution, we launched our second white paper. And Sherry, you basically quoted some of the learnings from that as well. And we gave an outlook on what we believe are the challenges for the future. So I will come back to that in a moment. Today, we are basically a large supplier for basically all approved vaccines players. We see that transportation across all of these temperature regimes, the normal 2 to 8 degrees, the -20 and the -70, -80 is possible. And we do that in our global networks. And you said, the German company. Yeah, we're a German headquartered company, but we're operating in 220 countries. So we're basically doing this either with heavy air freight and with express. There are, maybe in Europe and in the US, there are truck shipments, but so far we don't see really usage of ocean freight or rail services for vaccine distribution, because obviously everything needs to be very quick from the manufacturing into the arms of the patients. We're also involved in certain local storage and distribution activities in countries around the world. And we also obviously, next to the vaccine, what is very important is the shipment of ancillaries. And there is probably a volume factor of 30, if not 40, that is needed. So huge volumes that need to be shipped. And we saw also new solutions coming up, like real-time tracking of location of the vaccines, as well as its temperature. And the other thing that we basically took very close care of is in working with our corporate security, but also in terms of security organizations on the manufacturing side or with governments, to make sure that these vaccines get not stolen or are part of a target for theft and counterfeit as well. So today, 2 weeks ago, we had an announcement that we shipped 1 billion vaccines so far. So very proud on one side, but very humble on the other side as well. We believe that is only possible with the great collaboration that happened between all parties involved, logistic service providers, manufacturers, governments, and NGOs as well. We obviously have a huge commitment to support also NGOs in this difficult period. We did some secondment of our staff to the UNICEF organization to help them in the planning and so forth. And for the future outlook, I mean, as Sherry said, 10 billion is to achieve herd immunity for close to 8 billion people on the planet. But because there is a need for booster shots, there is the need for updates of the virus for mutants, or we talk about new eligible groups such as children now, and all of these shipments are starting now as well. There is a need for 7 to 10 billion vaccines probably in next year and the next year as well. And we also see activities of donation flights now happening from the Western world into low and middle income countries. UNICEF and COVAX are basically ramping up the volume and the supply into Africa, which is very, very important because the shipments there need to increase further as well. So, and that collaboration, we're very convinced, needs to continue. And maybe some words around policy insights so far. What we saw really is these first in-country shipments, they were planned very detailed, but once the shipment arrived, once a plane arrived there on the tarmac, there was very often the president, the Ministry of Health, there were journalists, there were sometimes even music chapels, and there was high security from police to army. And in our cases, we saw that the cargo went straight from the plane into a van into the vaccination points. So there was no delay, no waiting at border and customs. So that's great, a great achievement. But what is going to happen with the fifth shipment, the 10s, the 20s, if there is no prime minister, no music, no journalists waiting? Are these shipments also go fast through border controls and customs? So we believe that is very important. And therefore, we obviously welcome, and we have actively given also the input to the WTO on their activity for the customs watch list. And we believe this also is applicable not only for the vaccines, but for a lot of pre-products as well. So shipments going into the country of manufacturing, not only the destination country, but next to the vaccines, also all the ancillaries, the needles, the syringes that need to be shipped into these destination countries. Therefore, we have given our input on what are the SKUs, so that's a logistics term for the stock keeping units, all the items that need to be basically transported and transported fast to give a quick and safe vaccination of the people. So that's certainly something for the future. Let me just conclude with some closing statement. So basically, I think what we have seen is if all the parties are working close together, the pharmaceutical industry, logistics service providers, on the public side, the governments and NGOs, that huge task in logistics can be mastered. But we also need not to forget that this is basically, we are in here for the long run. This is a marathon, not a sprint, as we basically called one of the chapters in our white paper. So our collective effort really will need to stay. And with that, back to you, Ian.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating and hands-on and shows the complexity of delivering such a product. All the different stages. It's really fascinating. Craig, you also have experience with this. Could you maybe share your insights as well? Maybe perhaps go a bit beyond also the vaccines, and maybe with a focus on the developing country dimension. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in the panel. I think if anything that we all can agree on that we've learned in the last 18 months is that need truly does drive innovation. And the good news is that the need for a COVID vaccine has driven innovation, and we've delivered a safe and effective vaccine that's available and largely able to be put into arms in a large part of the population in the world. Unfortunately, the bad news is we failed in terms of equitable distribution. 70% of vaccinations are going to a handful of countries, and those countries are the wealthier nations. The poorer nations sit at 3% of total vaccination. So we have a long way to go in terms of taking this fantastic developed group of vaccines and getting them to equitable distribution. UPS has extensive experience delivering COVID vaccines similar to DHL. We're at about 670 million doses delivered of vaccines to 67 countries on the commercial side and another 50 countries on the clinical trial side prior to commercialization. So the good news is we've had 0 temperature excursions at very low temperatures and ultra cold, and that requires a lot of coordination and innovation. Of the 670 million doses, about 50 million doses have gone into lower income countries. And of that, a large portion of those transportation and storage has been funded by the UPS Foundation. And we've really learned, and what I want to answer your question about how does trade policy help us go forward, I'm going to leverage both the commercial side of that, my experience, as well as the humanitarian side of my experience. So why do we have such a big disparity in wealthier nations and poorer nations in terms of vaccine distribution? I think there's 3 reasons. One is countries are inherently driven by self-interest. The second is, at the beginning, certainly for a long time, there simply wasn't enough vaccine available. So there was a supply side challenge. And then I think this third piece is supply chain readiness in the developing world for ultra cold vaccines. And that's what I want to focus on, because the first 2, the supply side has largely been fixed. We heard national leaders as well as international organizations on a conference call last week committing to donate billions of doses globally. We went from 500,000 from the US to 1 billion. Other nations have also committed similar numbers. And in total, we will have a supply side fix. And the self-interest is becoming less important as nations that have had the opportunity to vaccinate large portions of their population are now willing to share. That's the good news. The bad news is we still struggle on supply chain readiness for ultra cold in particular in the developing world. So how can we help? I want to tell the story in particular to one country that I spent a month in working with the Ministry of Health. One of the poorer nations in Africa. And this country had no ultra cold freezer capacity in the country, and they had no dry ice capacity in the country. So they were a very a good case study to look at for the challenges facing these countries. And we were able to help distribute ultra cold freezers into this country, to put ultra cold freezers into portable ones into each of their district hospitals, to allow for storage, as well as provide paraffin-based phase change material carrying cases for the district hospitals to get doses out to local villages and to hundreds and hundreds of dosing sites. That's the good news. The physics and the chemistry of that vaccine working in Berlin is the same as it is working in Benin. It's the same. The challenge is how do those countries have access to the understanding of how to get ready, how to get prepared. There's a lot of, you mentioned, a number of people have mentioned the need for services. There's a consultancy piece here that's very beneficial to these countries to know, what do I need to do to be able to receive that vaccine? Who gives me the ultimate stamp of approval to say I'm ready so that COVAX can send me my allotment? In that process today, there are a number of players, and it's somewhat clouded. In this particular instance, I'll just speak to these freezers going into this one country. There are some pretty normal requirements on the trade side in terms of shipping documentation and so forth, but there were also a few things that were very unique. So you need a commercial invoice, you need shipper's declaration, you need an electronic export declaration, you need something for the Bureau of Statistics to say where those freezers are going. You need a certificate of origin. Also, on the receiving end, to avoid duty and taxes, the Ministry of Health needs a donation letter that needs to be approved by the Ministry of Health and then forwarded over to Customs to receive and approve that formal waiver of duty and tax before that donation of freezers can be delivered. Just one example of many challenges for these developing nations to receive things that they need, tools that they need in order to be prepared to take the ultra cold vaccine. So my question to trade and policymakers is, we know that there's been great work done and it's already been mentioned on this call, to have vaccines move through trade barriers relatively freely. And that's great. But what more can we do in terms of services, but as well as the tools like ultra-cold freezers or PCM-based carrying cases or drones or temperature and GPS transmitters? Those regulations and the barriers to trade on those items are very important, not maybe equally, but similar in importance to moving the actual vaccine so that when they're received in those countries, they can be taken. The second thing is there's really no shortage of funding and vendors to supply these tools and consultancy, and there's providers in the logistics world as well. How do we help, and how can the WTO help link the ministries of health with these funding sources and with these vendors in a smoother way? The need for public-private cooperation has probably never been greater, and that will continue, as mentioned by a number of people, for a couple of years. This isn't a short-term issue. We think that governments must continue. Oh, I'm sorry. Just one couple closing thoughts. Governments have to continue to work directly with manufacturers and providers of vaccine transportation to assess readiness in their cold chain. Getting that readiness plan approved and in place is the key to receiving doses. Continuing to make sure that we don't have export restrictions on doses globally is important, and making sure that there's smooth trade for that. But I would also encourage us to look at the services around those, as well as the tools that help facilitate ultra-cold. And we need to make sure that countries know how to achieve readiness. What's the formula, what's the process they have to go through in order to achieve readiness to be approved to receive their doses that are allotted. I started off by saying that need drives innovation. I think that's true in global trade policy, just like it was true in the creation and development of effective vaccines. And I look forward to the further conversation and questions.
Thank you, Craig. That was really fascinating, actually, to show again the complexity, new angles, and just making sure that countries can actually receive whatever is delivered or offered to them. So that's one aspect of the conversation that I had not expected so much. I'll be asking you a few follow-up questions. Some questions from the audience are coming in. I'll weave them in over time. But I found it very interesting that practically all speakers spoke about this, private-public partnership and this cooperation between the WTO, the governments, and the companies. Where to start? Maybe back to you, Diane. Can you tell us a bit more in more detail? You only had a few minutes. Where the conversation right now is between the WTO as institutions and the companies on making sure vaccines and the broader healthcare products are delivered now, regardless of whether we have some paper at MC12 or a new agreement a few years down the line. Where is this conversation now?
Thank you, Jana. And yes, I mean, it's true that, of course, each member has established dialogues at domestic level, at regional level, and this definitely needs to be pursued. The Director General of the WTO has been very active in promoting a very active dialogue with the stakeholders, in particular business, but also other voices. And that's notably to respond to the comment that the WTO has often been seen as a bit disconnected from what happens on the ground. So basically, you need to have this more direct conversation, and I think that's has been helpful to move the needle. And now clearly the membership has MC12 in mind, and I would say this challenge of living up to living up to the expectations in terms of providing a meaningful response on the trade side to the pandemic is clearly there. I mean, on the services side, maybe, because this is obviously the angle of this session. I mean, they've clearly played a role in weathering the crisis. And it's interesting, if you look at the trade monitoring report that was circulated by the WTO Secretariat in July, it's very clear that members have adopted a number of COVID-specific trade-related measures on services, especially at the beginning of the crisis, actually, so as to ensure a fast and efficient response to mitigate the various impact of the crisis. And most of these measures appear to be trade facilitating. I mean, typically in transport, for instance, as was mentioned, but also some flexibilities in financial services as well. So clearly, and we got very practical issues set out today in our debate, there is a conversation to have and experience to share here in WTO on transparency, on what services sectors and measures have helped ensure resilience and would help ensuring further resilience and support recovery.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, that's a conversation to be continued. Sherry, maybe a follow-up question to you. I mean, do you have any comments on what has been said by everyone so far? And could you get back more detail to the specific services dimension? I mean, if there were a declaration at MC12 or some new rulemaking to start after that, what specifically is it that is lacking? Is it something more holistic? Should the WTO get on with everything from, you know, e-commerce to services, domestic regulation, or should there be something specific to healthcare services?
Well, thank you very much, Ilana. That's a very wide-ranging question. I can start before I want to move to another aspect by putting in a plug and a very hopeful note for the conclusion of the Joint Statement Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation for MC12, which I understand is moving very fast towards conclusion. And this would just be a very, very major step forward for the WTO. And if successful, which I hope and believe it will be, this will actually be the very first outcome on services the WTO will have achieved since it coming into existence. So it's absolutely, it will be remarkable and very important. And the OECD has calculated that, you know, with such an agreement, the reduction in cost, logistics, administrative costs due to streamlining regulation and making it more transparent and more efficient can be as much as 7%. So it's very important. And obviously that will help any of the logistical needs as well that we have in the COVID response that is now being undertaken. So this is very positive. Now to the second part of your question, I just want to answer it by saying what could be service specific? Well, I want to, again, go back to what APEC has decided. The member economies of APEC understood that the declaration itself on services, the statement is on essential services, supporting essential goods is not enough. And that in addition, work has to be carried out to actually identify what role governments can play in allowing to have putting in place rather a framework that will allow these critical services to facilitate trade in essential goods in a more effective way. So this 2-year project, which will be undertaken over the next 2 years, starting very soon, will actually canvass policies, government policies towards critical services in a pandemic. It will identify the bottlenecks in supply chain operations for essential goods and how many of these bottlenecks are caused by lack of attention or inappropriate policies towards services. And it will elaborate framework or a set of principles that governments may agree upon and then hopefully follow to ensure that services can play their critical role to facilitate trade, not only in this pandemic, but future pandemics. So this is what the project will come up with in 2 years' time. But what I want to highlight is this is not just a government effort. APEC is going to rely heavily on private sector input in carrying out this project. There are 3 different components and bodies within the Asia Pacific region that I'd like to highlight for this effort. The first is ABAC, that's the APEC Business Advisory Council, which will be intimately involved in the project. There is the PEC, of which I am a member, the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council. It's a tripartite organization, and one component of this is the private sector input. So we have access to private sector companies and the private sector advice and input in whatever projects are carried through. And we support APEC and its work. And thirdly, there is the Asia Pacific Services Coalition, which is also going to be instrumental in providing support and input to this process. So it is actually industry on the ground, as we've heard from DHL and UPS experts here, Thomas and Craig, that can give us these answers. And that will only be the only effective way that a framework that is useful can be developed. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sherry. That was really very, very enlightening, and have a closer look at what APEC is doing here from Europe. This is the opportunity to actually build in some of the questions that have come in. Sherry, you mentioned that there would be work on identifying bottlenecks, but I'm sure UPS and DHL have already identified a few of them. So here's a question from the audience. Maybe I'll give it to Thomas first. What are the key bottlenecks that, if removed, could facilitate medical logistics services to developing countries? Charles Lohr. I mean, this has been already
thank you for the question.
Yeah. Can you sum it up? The top 5.
Yeah,
or whatever.
thank you for the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that need to be mastered. I mean, it is the global capacity for vaccines, but also for ancillaries. I mean, we are now working on different frontiers. We're shipping vaccines from the manufacturers, and a lot of them are in the Western world, but not only. Some of them are in India, in Russia, and in China as well, and distribute them to the destination countries. But what we see as well is that there the supply is increasing. So on the supply side, as Craig said as well, a lot of capacity is added to the global vaccine manufacturing capacity, which is good. But we see as well that a lot of ancillaries, like they are typically low-cost items coming from China and India and traveling by ocean freight. There is a bottleneck on ocean freight capacity. Now that basically these relatively low-value items travel on air freight. Air freight charter prices are going through the roof as well. And out of some countries, there's hardly capacity as well. All of these things need to be synchronized to basically come together in the country of destination, not only vaccine, but also the needles and the syringes and everywhere. And then obviously in some countries where there is no ultra low freezer capacity, domestic hurdles, as Greg has mentioned them, need to be overcome as well. Now, the good news is that obviously the manufacturers are improving stability and have more long-term stability tests of their vaccines as well. So for instance, for the -70-degree Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, now the normal fridge shelf life has increased a couple of weeks ago up to 4 weeks. That gives a lot of possibility also to manage it in domestic distribution in parts of Africa and Latin America as well. So different factors, but capacity and the coordination is certainly at the moment from what we see the overarching issue.
Thank you very much for this feedback. Craig, a similar question to you, but one that also integrates a question from the audience. So can you, I mean, you've talked about it, of your bottlenecks, but are we a related question is, now that we're focusing so much on vaccines, vaccines and COVID-related products, are we maybe having, underserving other healthcare products?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the opposite is true in terms of Ultracold. When we solve the Ultracold challenge related to COVID vaccines in countries, we also are solving the Ultracold challenge for cell and gene therapy and oncology treatments and other things that need Ultracold. And those freezers and that supply chain is a fixed asset. So when it goes in place, it's not that those freezers are going to go away and that the capacity is going to go away at the end of COVID. And so the way we're talking about it with investments and the way we're talking about it with ministries of health is we're planning for an Ultracold distribution in a country for the COVID vaccine. However, that's just the foundation of where you can go from that in the future. I think that's really important. You asked the question earlier about what do we need? What are some specifics? I think one thing that we can talk about is the definition of essential goods. So yes, a vaccine is an essential good. The PPE related to it, essential good. How about gloves in a country that has never used the appropriate gloves to handle dry ice before? That's a challenge we're having right now in one specific country. How about GPS trackers in a country that's never used GPS trackers live in their network before? There are regulatory issues that have to go through some items that might be dual use, as an example. So there are these regulatory issues as we expand that definition of essential goods for pandemic. I think there's some things in there that could be very helpful. I think, again, and I mentioned a little bit earlier, there is funding. When you hear people talking about the money that they're putting in and different agencies as well as private companies, just large amounts of money, how are we able to help facilitate getting that into the places where it needs to be to do the most good in the shortest amount of time? That I think is a challenge. People movements, that's a challenge for us. We have also sent some people into different countries to do work on the ground. There's only so much you can do on Zoom. At some point, you need to get in a room. And just from personal experience, but as well as a few members of our team that are still out in the field, just being able to move between countries is a challenge. Understanding part of that's common sense with the Delta spikes and so forth, but how can we make it easier for essential workers to move from country to country? Last thing, I'll just give a real life example. We're trying to move a small fleet of refrigerated vehicles from one country in Africa to another because the country that has those refrigerated vehicles really doesn't need them for all kinds of good reasons, good progress. They don't need. There's another country a few hundred miles away that could really use those trucks. Even going through the process of relicensing, GST, and it's pandemic related, the delay is about 6 weeks. What could we do if that was hey, that's an essential item, that's an essential good. Let's get past all that and let's go to this definition that allows us to do things just more freely when it's pandemic related.
Well, thank you. That was really very concrete there. So, I mean, we have 7 more minutes to go here. So I'll, and there are relatively few questions coming in. I mean, the audience here, there is a room for one more question if you want, bring it on. But I have plenty of questions in my sleeve as well. Diane, I have a question for you now, because what seems to be emerging also is that this is a work for the long haul in a way. You know, APEC is trying to identify. There is work on definitions that needs to be done. And on top of that, we need to act urgently, nonetheless. So, you know, keep going. So this is two-track work here. How do you see, because we are here in Geneva at the WTO, and this is a negotiator's room, how do you see work post MC12 emerging on this issue? Do you expect more of this collaboration with business and other international organizations? Where does the EU want to take this conversation going forward after we have this end of November ministerial meeting?
Thanks, Ian. An easy question. I think I mean, post-MC12 seems to be quite far away, actually, from a negotiated point of view. I think, and now clearly there's a sense that clearly expectations are very high to live up to this challenge, as mentioned earlier, on promoting public health, while also addressing this key issue of equitable access that was mentioned before. And how do we do that? I mean, on the EU side, we're pretty much convinced that if we manage to find a way forward on the in the intellectual property debate, as well as find a way forward on the more classical trade-related issues, then we can find a way forward for MC12 and beyond. So obviously time is fairly short, but we believe that now that we have a process underway, which is led by Ambassador Walker, the conversation is going on, including as well in the TRIPS Council, and there are ways to bring all that together for a meaningful outcome to emerge at MC12. I mean, we do not underestimate the challenge, but there are ways that we could agree on a set of key principles at MC12 and basically agree on some sort of work program and subsequent milestones to deliver in the near future. I think, I mean, we clearly got the message that the WTO is there as well, alongside other international organizations to deliver on expectations. And clearly the fact that we have these regular dialogues with the private sector clearly helps in showing what are the priority directions.
Thank you very much, Jan. I mean, Craig said need breeds innovation. It seems to be that even in the way the WTO functions, there seems to be some innovation ongoing there as well in terms of partnering up with other institutions and the business sector, which raises other questions, but that's for another panel. Sherry, how do you see the work that is done at APEC level interacting with what's going on at the WTO? Can you tell us more? What's going on, if at all, or what should be going on? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I cannot say what should be going on because that's a decision of APEC member economies to decide what to take forward. But I can say that in the past, APEC has served very often as an incubator for actions and decisions that have been carried on and taken up and then made contextual by the WTO. And this has happened in more cases than one, including many people say for the conclusion of the Uruguay round in the past. So APEC economies have been traditionally a very strong force for driving multilateralism forward. And I would suspect that in the case that we're talking about today, namely raising the profile of services and the need to look at services and as part of a holistic response to the pandemic by the WTO, they would very much also likely play this role once the project has run its course in a couple of years' time and there is an outcome, and perhaps even prior to that as well. I think that it's notable that all 21 economies and APEC are members of the WTO. So by definition, you know, they are very much an integral part of what happens in Geneva and the decisions that are taken. And these are very economies that represent a strong proportion of world trade. As I mentioned, about half, 50%, that's very highly significant. So it is extremely important what they do, what they decide, and their actions do often represent a path forward. We don't have many minutes left and I might not have a chance to speak again. So are you going to save a last round for one last comment?
Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, I think we will be cut off in exactly 1 minute, so we really cannot go over
Oh,
time.
I see. Okay. Okay.
So
Thank you very much then.
yeah. No, this is a fascinating panel. I think it's only the beginning of a conversation. We had a fascinating insights from the ground, from business on how this works. And this is really a multifaceted issue. Thank you also to Sherry and to Diane for giving two very different perspectives from policy on this. I think this conversation will stay for a long time with us. Thank you very much. There was one question I had to leave on moving personnel, but that was raised by Craig anyway. So thank you again for being with us. Rich and fascinating conversation. I think this is a file we will be all following very closely, and that will move, hopefully, move quickly in the coming months and years. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.